Welcome to week 3 of UX UI AI. As a reminder, this week we're going to be talking about creating data sets as well as training our models. So I wanted to sort of turn this week, since this is kind of a week that wasn't necessarily planned, but the more I think about it, the better of an idea it is. I wanted to talk about sort of the UX of creating data sets and training models. Um, some of the videos this week, I think, will just walk through sort of the experience of doing some of these things, which is obviously the best way you can learn. Just trying it yourself, you'll see that so much of this stuff is really poorly done and really hard. And I think, again, the whole goal of this class is to get more people involved in these processes and thinking about the best ways to approach them. And I think I've got some videos, some walkthroughs this week that'll sort of highlight some different approaches, some bad approaches, some good approaches, that sort of thing. So I think I'll be good uh, to mostly focus on the walkthroughs this week. So the lecture this week, I hopefully will be a little bit shorter than usual, and we can just dive into like looking at some of these tools. I wasn't going to cover this whole idea, this whole process in this class, but then I started thinking about it more. So I think like one of the ideas that we're sort of seeing happen today is that everyone is gravitating toward these big models. And these big models are sort of being called what are maybe generalized or what are starting to be called world models. So that's the Chat GPT, that's the DALI, that's the Stable Diffusion of the world. Um, and I think maybe there's this idea that like those models can encompass everything, right? The idea of a world model meaning that it basically recreates the world in the model itself. But I think the more and more I think about it, the more the reality is actually that's not going to happen. What we're going to end up with are these sort of generalized world models, and they're good for a certain purpose. Like the idea is that, you know, these things are so massive in how much resource they use, right? They use thousands upon thousands of GPUs to train. They cost millions of dollars just to even make them. That they're more or less owned by these big companies, right? So OpenAI, Google, Facebook, Stability, like these are the companies that have the money to make these happen. And they do contain this massive amount of knowledge, but that massive amount of knowledge is often generalized, right? It's, we're still not yet at a place where we can really contain every single idea and concept in its own model without some generalization. And that leaves this world where, like, if you as a designer are working like, yeah, but I really want to work with my own style. I want to work with the style of a particular artist that I'm really familiar with that isn't included in these models. You do need to do something that we would call fine tuning or transfer learning or another thing. And what that leads me to think about more is like, we're probably going to end up in a world where like that will always be the case. We're always going to have to turn these generalized world models into individual models, or at least many times we're going to have to, right? So some of the stuff we'll talk about this week is like, what if I want to make a model that just encompasses my own design language or the design language of the brand I work with? Or I want to use the same voice and tone that's been dictated by, the brand designers on the team, whatever it is. Um, these are real world issues that essentially these generalized models can't know or don't know about. They're not going to know about my specific brand. They might, if it's like Pepsi or something, they might have some of that data involved in their model training, but it's still going to be generalized enough that it might not like really actually be accurate or make a lot of sense. So we're going to probably lead to a world where we have more of these individual local models. And I sort of see these local models as like things that require a lot less resources. You can run them on your laptop. You can train them on a single GPU. They're going to take those big models and sort of narrow them down. And this might be by individual, it might be by company, it might be by groups, teams within a company. And they'll be much more narrow in terms of their focus, right? So they won't be trying to encompass everything, but they'll maybe say, here's the guidelines for writing in the voice and tone of our brand. Or here's the color palette for this particular part of our application. And the goal for them is to be much more accurate, but also to be customized for unique needs. And I think this is probably the reality. I mean, I've yet to see anyone really say that like this is going to become a possibility with even these big, huge models. And I think like what's likely going to happen is we're going to end up with a world where like we'll always have these big models, right? There's always going to be the Googles and the Facebooks and the OpenAIs of the world that are trying to make the biggest models possible that solve the most generalized needs available to everyone. But that everyone is maybe going to have their own personalized and customized AI, right? Like if you want to respond to emails in the way that seems like you and not like some chat GPT person. Side note, I don't know if anyone else experienced, I've definitely experienced where like I get emails from people that I used to talk to frequently, and I can tell they've like run this thing through ChatGPT to respond to me, and it doesn't feel like them, and that just feels so awkward. And I think like part of the learning curve of these tools is realizing that like they do feel kind of inhumane, or like they don't feel personalized enough. And I think we will likely get to this place where everyone will have their own tool set. Maybe we won't think about it as AI, and we'll just think about it more as personalization, but that the process behind the scenes might be AI or something like that. And I think it's important for us to start to think of now about like what is that user experience going to look like? How much of it is going to be forcing someone to actually make a data set in the pattern we require, uploading it, doing that sort of thing. That there's actually a couple of examples that I'll show this week that I think are starting to hint toward a future that's a little bit different than like the traditional training process that people go through today. I have talked about data sets previously in a class. Like, I don't really want to go too deep into making data sets because it's a really complicated topic if we're talking about images or text or whatever. I did a class, man, it's almost 3 years ago now, on making data sets for ML art. Now, that would be more visual art, more like StyleGAN era stuff, but I think a lot of the concepts and ideas behind it still hold. So if you want to go and look at that stuff to understand how to make like an image data set and some of the thinking that has to go on behind the scenes, I would definitely recommend checking that out. I'll touch on a couple topics from it today, but I really won't go too deep into it. There's a lot of content in there that I think I'll reference here that you might want to go dive in and check out more there if you're interested in that specifically around images. There won't be a lot of text-based stuff there, but if you're interested in image data sets and making them, like that class is kind of like, at the moment, that was everything I knew, and probably still like most of the stuff I know today. So I do think there's a bunch of UX considerations, and I think the way I'll do this lecture is just sort of break these down into like individual pieces as we go through it. So the actual creation of a data set could be a really amazing UX experience, and today it's kind of painful if anyone does anything with it at all. And in fact, I think some of the stuff that the designer interview we're going to talk to today this week is not with a designer, but with more of a programmer, data visualization person by the name of Ian Johnson. And our interview just kind of goes into a lot of like, ways in which you can explore data and ways in which you can begin to, use different tools to understand the data better. And I think that's a really interesting process. Before you even create the data set or before you're even training a model, it's almost like understand the data you have and how that might influence the way in which you train a model. So I think there's a lot of considerations in the whole data set creation part. Here's just a couple of questions that I would have if I was the user behind these tools. It's like, what data do I need? Do I need images? Do I need text? Do I need images with classes? That sort of thing. How much do I need? This is always a huge question within machine learning. Is a lot of people say like, I've got 10 images. Is that enough to work with? In a lot of cases, that's not. You need more than 10 images. You need 100. You need 1,000 images. In the case of text, like, how much text would you need in order to replicate my tone of voice or the way that I write? It might be a lot. It might be, maybe it's a couple paragraphs. It might be a lot more than that. Where do you get the data? So for a lot of these cases, like, you might have an okay chunk of data on your company, but you want more data than that. How do you go find that data? And then lastly, like, this is always the most painful part of it. Even a painful part is I did some of these walkthroughs this week, is like formatting. Formatting tends to be very strict, and if you make even the slightest errors, you get weird error messages you need to resolve for. It's a huge pain in the ass, and it's like it's not something that I would expect anyone that's not a data researcher, data analyst, or machine learning person to have to understand. But we might be in a world where we want customers to do this, and how can we sort of massage it so it feels more like a worthwhile experience and not like I'm trying to bang my head against the wall. So what data? So again, this could be image data, it could be text data, it could be tabular data. By that I mean like a table, like an Excel file. But even within this, there's so many considerations, right? So within image data, there's resolutions, there's colors, there's, classes, right? There could be categories of image data. Similarly with text data, it's like, what's the format? Am I supporting many languages? Am I, adding labels to individual pieces of text? Is the text paragraphs? Is it individual sentences? Is it individual words? There's a lot to think about through these. And then with tabular data in Excel files, wherever it is, there's so much to think through there. It's like all the different rows and columns you need to think through, all the individual type of data within each one of those categories. there's a lot here, and this is where it's like hard for me to be like, okay, let's talk about individual data problems, because each model likely has a different unique data set that it requires. And this is going to be a big data problem. You'll want to work with the engineering and product teams to format the data in the right way, but maybe on the UX side, you want to be able to let customers add anything and then you figure out the formatting. And that adds a whole layer of abstraction, but it definitely would help a customer make things feel a little easier for them. Where do you get the data? So I've got a video for this week on just finding data sets. So this is three of the sites that we look at. So we look at Hugging Face, we look at Papers with Code, and we look at Kaggle. And we'll see that across all of them, the search experience is fairly similar, but not great. And you'll see that you get different data sets across every different site. And I would say, with the example I had, I couldn't find one data set that gave me exactly what I wanted. And again, there's probably a whole product design team right here to solve this problem. And that's, again, I think Erica brought up the ladders of abstraction problem last week, where it's within this entire experience, there are different sections you could sort of pull apart, and that's an individual problem to solve that could be a whole company, right? Just finding and gathering and collecting and annotating data, there are many companies out there that is their whole product. And that's before you even get to turning it into a machine learning problem. So I think there's a huge opportunity here, and maybe some of you are already working in these areas of just collecting data, making sure the data is categorized and formatted correctly, and making it visible to customers. Another thing that I think is really funny is, a lot of the data sets that are out there today are built by researchers, and often built by the interns at research labs. And often they involve scraping the web, or they involve pulling data from, sources, and the reality is no one even looks at what's in them. They just run a test on it. If it works, then it's good. But we are learning that higher quality data sets do lead to higher quality models. This is from 2020 now, which, God, that's 4 years ago already. But I was looking through Google has this data set called the Flowers TF, which is basically a folder of different types of flowers. Then inside each flower folder, there's a number of images. And if you go through it manually, you'll see there's some really crappy images in there. This is an image from the sunflowers category, and it's clearly not a photorealistic sunflower. I don't even know what this image is from, probably from a video game or something. Similarly, there's a data set of faces called Celeb A. It's probably from 2018 now, maybe even earlier. And one of the problems with that data set is also time, right? It was built in 2017, 2018, and it only works with the celebrities of that era. And if you actually look through it, most of the photos are of Obama and George Bush, because it turns out there's just a lot of photos of presidents that are freely available to download. So there's all sorts of problems with the data sets that even are publicly available today. And there's probably a whole set of tools that people could begin to build to even make higher quality data sets, which would be an interesting problem to solve for. Another classic thing that I think kind of gets missed now. Again, we're at this point where data sets are just all about scale, and it's all about, can I get more data? That often we never look at the data we have, and even trying to see are there groupings here that we can begin to think about. This is a visualization, and I am not a data visualization expert. Ian, in our interview, talks about some of this stuff, and I think he's far more experienced and far more of an expert in that area than I am. But there are a lot of tools out there to do what we call clustering, image clustering, data clustering, whatever, that use things like tsne, this is an example of tsne. There's UMAP, there's PCA. I cover some of these in that dataset class from a couple years ago. If you're interested in that, definitely recommend going to check that out. Again, too big of a topic for us to talk about it in this week alone. But the idea of before we even train our model, what do we let's look at the data we even have and begin to understand that. Maybe we don't need a model. Maybe just doing a cluster analysis is enough for us to understand what we need to solve for. Obviously, when you talk to generative AI and that sort of thing, yes, you need a data set in order to generate stuff. But if you're just looking at classifying or understanding your data, then maybe these tools are enough for you. Or maybe they even help you understand how to correctly cluster your data so that when you train the model, it's actually using that data in the smartest way possible. Actually, maybe this is a bit of an aside, but I'd seen someone tweet something. I'm just gonna let this audio play. Okay, that's enough of that. I actually had seen someone tweet about something like this week, where it was basically an interface of samples that you could then sort of navigate through with your cursor, and it would play those samples as a way to sort of explore a data set. And it kind of reminded me of this project that Kyle McDonald had done in 2016, which was very similar, taking all of the sound samples, applying some process to it, and then organizing them according to this t-SNE process. So you can kind of see that as they navigate, I'm going to turn this audio off, as they sort of navigate through the space, it generates all these different sounds. And I think, one, this is an interesting little art performance tool, but also I think it's fascinating to think about the interfaces we could create to explore our data sets more closely and understand what's even in our data set. Today, like when I make an image data set, I'm just opening up a folder of thousands of images and clicking through them one by one. But it would be interesting to think about how we could collect those into groupings, explore the groupings. Again, sort of that ladder up abstraction idea, right? Start high, see the clusters, zoom in, see what's in a cluster, and then zoom in even closer to see what's actually in the images. And I think we're going to begin to see more and more of this, as we begin to build out these tools, because they're almost necessary at this level. When you've got this many samples, you have to generate something of this scale to be able to explore these things. Otherwise, you can't really do it one by one. You can't see the connections between things. So I think it's a fascinating area that I hope sees more like a return to sort of these sort of interfaces and exploration tools. A common question, or maybe a question that comes up every now and then, is people ask me is like, can there be too much data? Certainly there's a minimum that we need to meet, but is there a maximum? And this gets into stuff that, again, is sort of outside of my expertise. But there is this concept of the curse of dimensionality, which I will probably butcher this explanation, and there's probably better ones. If you just Google search curse of dimensionality, you'll find a lot of articles. But the idea here is imagine an Excel file that has, I don't know, 100,000 columns, or let's just say even 1,000 columns. As we begin to cluster that, those columns get so far apart that it becomes hard to do clustering across them. So you kind of see in this graphic here, it's easy to cluster stuff in 2 dimensions. But in 512 dimensions, these things get so far apart that they're actually hard to cluster. Now, I've heard certain people say like curse dimensionality is real. It's actually a real problem. Then I've also heard other people say like, we thought theoretically that curse dimensionality would be a real problem, but then when we actually build our models, it turns out it really isn't. And I think some of that comes down to this other thing, which is called non-uniformity, which is essentially the idea that yes, theoretically, your data can be so diverse and so far apart that it's hard to do clustering, but in reality, that's not how the real world works. So I guess a good example of this would be like, imagine you're trying to track ages and age groups of people. And let's say you go to a school, like a kindergarten school, or like, early school, so like K through 4 or something like that. If you go and track ages there, you're going to see clusters around the individual classes, so kindergarten, first, second, third, fourth, and then maybe some clustering on the teachers. But you're not going to find someone that's like 1,000 years old, because that's not theoretically possible. So your clusters, when you take that data in, will be a little bit clearer and be kind of mapped to the groupings that you have available to you. If this were like purchase data, like around who's buying what at like home price or something, you might see clusters around the ages of people who can actually buy homes. Today that would be like 30 plus, maybe retirees are probably not buying homes, they're like selling their houses, that sort of thing. So that's a long way to say that like I personally have found that like anytime I run a machine learning model on data, it at least generates something. My example this week actually doesn't work that well, and that's partly because of some of this, which is like I've got too diverse of sources. We'll get to that in that video. But there can be something that's too much data, but it's actually like too much data with too many classes and not enough sort of coherence among those classes. And that is a problem to sort of look for. We're trying to like classify by too many unique variables, that can create issues. But in general, like more data is going to be better, and more data points are also worth exploring and seeing correlations amongst things. There's of course this whole category again of like tools for data set creation, especially if you're working in image data sets. There are like a ton of opportunities to build better tooling. These are tools that I've used or created for object detection or for generating images for data sets. On the left is a tool called Label Image. I have an old recording of how to use that tool that I'm going to share with everyone. I didn't really feel like creating a new one because honestly the tool has not really changed that much. It's a little old school looking. I mean, you'll see like these icons are looking like they're straight out of the 90s, but the tool works fairly well and it does allow you to create this data set, which is, one of the challenges is like taking an image data set but also applying classes to it, or in the case of object detection, also applying boxes to things. That's a really like manual labor challenge, and a lot of the data sets have been made either by underpaid labor overseas or by interns or that sort of thing. So I always recommend like try this stuff out yourself. Like you'll find like, wow, this is a really hard problem. I bet there's an easy way to do this, et cetera, et cetera. On the right is actually a tool that I made a couple years ago when I was teaching StyleGAN classes like pretty much every month. I started to build up a little library of tools that you could generate your own data sets from. With those tools, a lot of it is around centering, making sure that the images are the right resolution. So I built in lots of little tools and tips and techniques to sort of like give additional features to people. And again, I'm not really much of a tool builder myself in my day job. So this was a really eye-opening experience for me to begin to build this stuff. But again, there's just so many different steps in this process, and design can step in at any one of those steps and really begin to make a concerted effort to change things and make things better. In fact, recently, when I was doing research for this week in particular, I came across this tool called RoboFlow Auto Distill. I've used RoboFlow in the past, and I've actually got a video on using some of its tooling. But the idea of Auto Distill is actually to use these big, huge foundational models or world models, and what they do from there is they basically assign, or they like are able to guess and infer your data set from these bigger models. So let's say you want to find, the red ball in all the balls. I don't know, for every reason you're making balls. So you've got blue balls, red balls, green balls, and you want to create a machine vision model that can detect all the red balls, or a red shape of some kind. And they're able to basically train a model without you having to make any annotations whatsoever, which is amazing. That would be a huge game changer because creating these object detection models or data sets such a pain in the ass. So much manual labor. So they've gone ahead and basically skipped the data set creation part and like automated it using these other tools. I think that's a really fascinating concept. There's probably a lot of ways for you to integrate something like ChatGPT, where it's a text messaging system, and building that into its own sort of object detection system. There's probably ways in which to do that. So again, really fascinating stuff, and I think we're going to see more and more of this. It's actually the first tool I've really seen that does this, although I imagine there are other tools that do it, but maybe don't announce it as much. So some really, really fascinating tools that, again, I think as we get more designers and more product people in the room and thinking about them, there's going to be some really great ideas there. Now let's talk a little bit about the UX considerations of the actual training process, right? So once we've got our data set done, how do we actually go about training the tools? And I think there's a lot of things to think about it within this category, and honestly, I've yet to see anyone do all of them well. So here's just a couple questions off the top of my head. So what steps are required, right? So what is the process of converting your data set into uploading it to this model training system, and then actually doing the training, and when you're done? What does training cost? This is a huge one. I find everyone does this in a really weird way, where the cost is always abstracted away, either as credits or as per hour, and you're like, well, how long is that going to be? It's a mess, and clearly some black hat stuff going on there, but so it goes. How do I know when it's done? I mean, this seems fairly straightforward, but would be surprised since it might take a couple hours. Is there any way for you to come back and remind me later, or whatever it is? This is a huge one for me. How do I know if it worked? How do I know if this model is good or not? Often we use these very technical things like loss scores or accuracy metrics, and to most of us that doesn't really make sense. So do we actually need to just test it and see how it works, or is there a better way for us to understand whether this thing is working well or not? And then lastly, how do we use the model? Especially with something like Hugging Face, where you have to go and find the model and then bring it back into another space, is very confusing. So I do find that a lot of these considerations are really missing and sorely lacking, and I'm hoping to see them change a lot in the near future. I've just got a couple screens I'm going to walk through of just sort of things I think are really poor, things that are working well. And then what we'll do a lot of sort of in this week is actually just look at some walkthroughs of me using tools, and you can sort of see where things fall apart. So if you get anything from this week, know that I hate the new auto train tool that Hugging Face has. I guess in the last class I taught on making video montages, I had stumbled across the old auto train system, which was a Hugging Face's way of basically a no-code solution to create classifiers and other things. And man, I love that tool. I shared that with everyone in the class, and I know a couple people said this was great. And then like 3 months later, they like literally just redid the entire thing, and it's terrible now. It's like a classic case of what happens when you give an engineer a tool versus a designer a tool. They just made this interface where it's like just a bunch of like knobs and drop downs and JSON files, and it's like complete unclear what you're doing. Error messages everywhere. They have to go in the logs to find. It is really poor. This is like the classic, like we took a good UX solution and like went backwards 10 years. So I do have recordings of both of these. So if you want to see what I thought was a good experience, I'm not saying it's perfect, but it was definitely like much more considered. You walk someone through the process. They sort of like, you're training them as you like go through it all. Whereas this is just like a dumping ground of things. So I've got videos for both if you want to compare the two. I hope you'll agree with me that the old one is much, much better in terms of user experience. I literally got in a fight with the product manager, engineering manager, and Hugging Face of this tool during their forums about how terrible I think this thing is. So maybe I'm going to be banned from Hugging Face in the next couple weeks. We'll see. So man, a great example of like what happens when you just like create a dumping ground of an interface and try to have customers use that. So bad example, don't do this. Hopefully, I mean, this is kind of where a lot of places are, right? Like Ian even mentioned this like dev mode. It's like you drop everything in there and you let people play with it, but you really need to start thinking about consideration and point of view and sort of like prioritization and highlighting the steps in the right order when you think about a UX experience for a non-developer or non-machine learning expert. Another thing that I thought like I really enjoyed that the old auto train did with Hugging Face was that you could train multiple models at once. Now that might sound kind of weird, like why would you do that? But for stuff like classifiers, there's a lot of sort of noise in the systems, and sometimes like just running it multiple times you'll get different results. So they have this nice thing where you could spend $12 to basically train 5 models at once rather than training one model at a time to sort of see how they work. And then they had this nice little interface where you could even see like, oh, how well are these doing? Like clearly these four are on par with each other, but this one is doing really poorly. And I just kind of like that as like, I know what these scores all mean. I know what's happening with these models, but like I can imagine, I mean, even for me as someone who does know what's doing, it's easier to just see this top level. Like when I was running these previously, I would get one that would be 100%, one that would be 95%, 75, and then 50. And it'd be clear which ones I should sort of focus my efforts on or begin to play with more. And I just thought that was a much better interface. The new one, you can't train multiple models. You have to do it manually every time. And then you have to sort of click around to get different scores to try to compare the two. Just comparative stuff is really, really helpful. As we've got like a wealth of potential options, it's good to have ways to compare things and understand what works well and what doesn't. I will also be doing a demo of a Runway ML tool where you can train your own image or character generator. These are like LoRa models that sit on top of text-to-image models. But actually, Runway has always had like pretty good UX. Again, I won't say it's perfect, but they've had a lot of nice features that I felt like I wish more places would have had. Runway, unfortunately, also does this thing where they often run it, they build a tool, they release it, and then like 6 months later, they kill it off. So on the left-hand side here is their version of the object detection. So basically, creating an object detection data set. They had a tool that you could do that. I have a recording of that from the era in which it existed. They have since killed it off. But I kind of love this idea that like as you're going through this and tagging data, they did have like, okay, you've got enough files, you've got enough annotations, but maybe in these categories you need more. And it would say, Omar, you need 25 more. Bone, you need 24 more. This will make more sense when you watch that video. Like, who are Omar and Bone? But when you watch that video, you actually will see like the tool did a good job of sort of guiding you through like, hey, you don't have enough data yet, or now you do have enough data, which again, I think is just something that we really, really need with our tools. On the right-hand side are some examples for their style generator. There's a little example link that you can pop up and you can see like, oh, this is what my images should look like. They should all be of a similar style. Maybe you have a similar color palette, look and feel. Like, again, maybe not as perfect as it could be. It'd be nice if as you're uploading images, you would actually have it sort of tell you like, hey, these images seem too diverse or whatever. But just having examples is honestly above and beyond what most places do. So I think it's a nice experience to sort of show these examples. So again, I really like Runway. If you are okay with paying for their tools, I think their tools are like some of the nicest in terms of UX. They put a lot of effort into that, and I think it sort of shows in the output of those tools. But one thing, again, sort of maybe like auto distill, what I think we're starting to see is actually like this process where we're sort of moving away from like the like create a zip file, upload the zip file, run the training. This is an example of creating a custom GPT in ChatGPT. And again, I've got a walkthrough of how this whole process works. But in this case, you're actually sort of like telling ChatGPT that you want to like sort of make a smaller version of ChatGPT that focuses on one task. And you do that through a text interface, which isn't always perfect, but I do sort of like the idea that they're trying something different. And then you can go and upload documents, and those documents are then automatically read into it. There's no training process. It just sort of either happens behind the scenes or happens on the fly. And I think we're going to move to more and more of that, right? The idea that like every individual is going to be able to download their documents, zip them up, format them correctly, and then like feed them to a model is probably unrealistic. But what we'll get to is actually a place where like the model or like the model and or tooling between the model and the user will begin to figure out when he's happened, right? And I think that's probably where we're going to end up, because we'll use AI to sort of like figure out, you know, what these documents are, process them in the right way, format them in the right way, and then feed them to a processing system behind the scenes so you get back a custom model. So while the custom GPT thing isn't perfect for me, and honestly for me it was a little weird because I'm like, just let me upload a file, like let me format this file or document it for you. Having to go through a little bit of a chat interface was like not for me, but I can see where people who are not comfortable with training in traditional like processes would actually like this. So I think there's some value to in exploring this and understanding this as well. So here's a couple of the walkthrough tools. There's more documented in the in our syllabus. Label image is like a classic object detection tool. It's that one that looks kind of funky and a little out of date, but it's worth sort of seeing how the whole tool works. Again, I've got a couple of things on auto train, including the crappy version and the better version. We've got one video on Runway ML. We'll probably do more Runway ML videos when we get into generative AI or generative images, generative video, and then there's the custom GPTs video as well. So again, I think the walkthroughs are probably more important than anything I've really discussed, because I think you'll get a better sense and a feel of like what's working, what isn't. And I just tried to grab a handful of different tools that I knew existed. If there are other ones out there that you think are really good and really important and maybe other people should know about, please drop them in our Slack channel, and maybe also record some walkthroughs of those tools. I think it's good just to have a library of sort of these things, especially because, to be quite honest, they always change and they always disappear. So it's good to document which ones are good and which ones are bad, because then you can hold it over Hugging Face in the future when you find their tools now suck, but they used to be good. So with that, I'll wrap up here and say check out some of the walkthrough videos, and then add any notes that you have in our Slack channel, questions, other good examples that you've seen out in the wild. There's so many tools out there now that's hard for me to keep track of all of them. So if you've seen a really good one that you think I've missed, please let me know. I'm happy to add those to our list of things to look at. All right, that's it. Thanks.